The Israeli military has already killed Al Jazeera journalists in its war on Gaza. Now it's accusing others of being terrorists. The network says the claims are baseless and an attempt to silence the few remaining reporters in Gaza. Why is Israel targeting Al Jazeera? And what are the risks for journalists inside Gaza? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Baseless and unfounded. That's the response from Al Jazeera Media Network after Israel accused 6 of its journalists in Gaza of belonging to Palestinian armed groups. The Israeli army maintains it has documents proving the correspondents are operatives of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. The network has rejected the allegations. It says it's an attempt to silence reports from the ground of the relentless Israeli bombardment. It is the latest in a series of Israeli crackdowns on Al Jazeera since its war on Gaza began more than a year ago. So what's behind it? And could this pattern of hostility silence the network? We'll get to all that with our guests in just a moment. But first, this report by Alex Baird.
Killed for doing their job. Reporting from one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a journalist. And now Al Jazeera correspondents in Gaza are coming under Israeli attack yet again. The Israeli military has released these documents, which it maintains as evidence that 6 of Al Jazeera's journalists are members of the armed wings of the Palestinian groups Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Al Jazeera Media Network says the allegations are baseless and has released a statement saying it views these fabricated accusations as a blatant attempt to silence the few remaining journalists in the region and obscure the harsh realities of the war from audiences worldwide. The Gaza government media office says Israeli forces have killed at least 177 reporters and media workers during its war, a number US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says is far too high.
We're equally determined that journalists be protected. Far too many have lost their lives in Gaza. We're determined to do what we can to ensure that, again, they can do their work as safely and securely as possible.
Earlier this month, an Israeli drone fired at Al Jazeera cameraman Fadi al-Wahidi, hitting him in the neck. He's now in a coma. Israeli forces also killed 5 family members of Gaza correspondent Wael Dahdu, among them his eldest son, Hamza, also an Al Jazeera journalist. And in July, an Israeli airstrike targeted the car of Al Jazeera correspondent Ismail al-Ghul, killing him.
You can see how this vest has become stained with Ismail's blood. What did Ismail do to deserve this? He conveyed the suffering of the people and the true image.
The Committee to Protect Journalists says Israel has repeatedly made unproven claims about Al Jazeera's correspondents without providing credible evidence. After killing Ismail, it produced documents maintaining he had received a Hamas military ranking in 2007, when he would have been 10 years old. Last month, Israeli forces raided Al Jazeera's office in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank and ordered it to close immediately. That followed a decision by the government in May to ban Al Jazeera from operating in Israel. The network is the only international news outlet still on the ground in northern Gaza, telling the stories of Palestinians under Israel's latest siege. Palestinian voices, it's feared, could be silenced. Alex Baird, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guests now. And from Copenhagen, we're joined by Mohammed Shehada, the Chief of Programmes and Communications at the Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor. In New York is Jodie Ginsberg, CEO of the Committee to Protect Journalists, which has spoken out against the accusations that Israel has levelled at Al Jazeera journalists. And in Tel Aviv, Gideon Levy, columnist at Haaretz newspaper and author of The Punishment of Gaza. A very warm welcome to all of you. Mohammed, I want to start with you because you've taken a close look through this evidence that Israel says it's provided to accuse these 6 journalists in Gaza of belonging to Palestinian armed groups. All these documents are available online. What did you make of them?
Basically, to start with, some of these journalists have been threatened repeatedly by the IDF, by Israeli authorities, to stop doing what they were doing, to stop their critical work, particularly in northern Gaza, or else face consequences. So this is very convenient that suddenly Israel finds out all of them are militants. But basically, if you look at the documents itself, you get the immediate impression that is a very badly collected fraud. For example, take, for instance, Anas al-Sharif, Al Jazeera's main journalist in northern Gaza at the moment. Basically, they claim that he was recruited in the Qassam brigades on his 17th birthday, on the day of his actual birthday, but that he was wounded with a lot of problems, weak hearing, a lot of problems with his sight, constant migraines, and incapacitated. In one document, they say he's, quote, suspended. In the next document, it shows him as a foot soldier. In the next document, it shows him as a Nukhba militant, that is Hamas's elite special force unit. If you look at another one, like Talal Arouqi, it shows that he was recruited in Hamas at the age of 15, something totally unheard of. Usually Hamas membership, you can only join them after you pass high school, so at the age of 18, presumably. So it's similar to how they claimed that Ismail al-Ghul, after they blew his head off, they said he was recruited into Hamas's military wing at the age of 10. But if one is gullible enough to fall for Israel's unevidenced, unsubstantiated propaganda and believe them, although they've been caught lying thousands and thousands of times since October 7th, if you take their claims at face value and you presume these journalists have some connection to Hamas or the Islamic Jihad, it's not sufficient to establish them as legitimate targets. You need to establish that they are active combatants taking parts in hostilities. Because on the Israeli side, many Israeli journalists are themselves reservists in the IDF. For instance, Barak Ravid, one of Israel's most prominent journalists, he suspended his reserve duty only last year in protest against Netanyahu. You have another journalist, for instance, like Nitzan Shapira, who is a journalist in Israel's most watched television channel, Channel 12, who is actively now a combatant taking part in the war in Lebanon. He's with the soldiers, they are fighting as a combatant. So it's not sufficient to just claim that they are affiliated. Hamas in Gaza is a government, a political party, a military group, and a part of civil society. They run a number of charities. So mere affiliation is insufficient. But even there in the document, it says, for instance, that Ala Salama is a member of the PAJ's media committee, so no active combatant role whatsoever. It says, for instance, that Sarraj has been excommunicated, fired, so it's not sufficient to establish them as legitimate targets.
Sure, a lot of discrepancies there. Jodie, I know you've seen the translated documents and CPJ has responded to them. What do you read into them?
Well, we see this as a pattern from Israel, frankly. It is not the first time that Israel has accused journalists, either in advance or most frequently after killing them, of being terrorists. We saw that with Hamza Dakhdour, we saw that with Ismail al-Ghul, but we've also seen that before this current war. In 2023, in May 2023, CPJ produced a report called Deadly Pattern, in which we identified this continual pattern by Israel of alleging that journalists are terrorists. And as we heard just now, that's rather convenient when they want to stop people from reporting.
Gideon, we know that this war has been going on for a year, and we know that these 6 men, they almost have like celebrity-like status on Al Jazeera Arabic. They'd be well known to the Israelis. Why target them now?
Why? Because Israel can. Look, Laura, if it would have depended on Israel, there wouldn't be Al Jazeera. There would be only Israeli TV and mainly Israeli propaganda TV. To blame, I don't know the details about each reporter. I have my doubts because I know the way that the Israeli propaganda throughout the army spokesperson is working. Maybe they were affiliated, maybe not, but being affiliated, as my colleague just said now, being affiliated doesn't make anyone a target. And above all, look at us, Israeli journalists. I mean, do we really report, the Israeli journalists are reporting independently in this war? Do they really tell the whole truth? Or are they serving a very clear narrative and they are not ready voluntarily? Nobody tells them to do so. They are serving only one narrative, telling only one story, not showing anything from Gaza. Part of them are serving in the army, in the reserves, part of them not, but it doesn't mean much. They all are very biased. I mean, that's one of the darkest times of Israeli media this last year, which brought me really to a situation in which I can't watch anymore Israeli TV because it became such a propaganda tool. So to come and to say that Al Jazeera, the only international outlet which is present on the ground in Gaza, if not Al Jazeera, we know nothing about what's going on in Gaza. And that's exactly what disturbs Israel. Israel wants to make this fight, to make this war, to make this mass killing without any disturbance and any cameras. And this is impossible in the democratic world and in the modern world. And therefore, Israel is trying to target, to give excuses for targeting. And the outcome, we all know, over 150 killed journalists, which by itself should have shocked Israel. By the way, it should have shocked Israel more than it should have shocked Al Jazeera, because the shame is on Israel, not on Al Jazeera.
Mohammed, as Gideon points out, the death toll for journalists is so high in Gaza. It is the most dangerous place in the world to act as a journalist. Hossam Shabat, he's one of the people who have been, one of the 6 who've been targeted here by Israel. He has said that these accusations intend to turn them into, quote, killable targets. Do you now fear for these men's safety in Gaza? More than perhaps you would already?
I was shaking as soon as I heard the news yesterday. I couldn't believe that Israel would take this very blatant step of silencing basically the very few remaining journalists alive in northern Gaza at a time where Israel is now at a peak moment of mass extermination, mass ethnic cleansing, mass starvation in northern Gaza in particular, in Jabalia, in Beit Lahi, and Beit Hanun. They've been there now for over 24 days of just non-stop depopulating of that part of Gaza. So it's a very, very frightening spectacle. But as you mentioned earlier, I have friends in Gaza who are journalists who've been telling me throughout the war that they're very terrified, very afraid to put on the journalist vest or mark themselves with any distinctive marking that says press or oust them as journalists, because they fear that this is just going to put a hit target on your head. I even have colleagues who are afraid to do their jobs as journalists. They just decided to hide throughout the war and not perform any sort of activity so that they don't become targets. This is unheard of any other conflict that you can think about in the last 2 decades, at least, if not more. It's basically Israel is now launching a targeted assassination against international law and international humanitarian law, particularly the principle of distinction and proportionality. You see this very conscious effort to label everyone in Gaza not as a civilian combatant, but either as a terrorist or a human shield for a terrorist. You don't hear Israel saying Gazan civilians anymore. Human shields or and that is a very frightening spectacle. It is part of this Israeli very conscious, plausible genocide that they are committing to finish off the Gaza question with absolutely no restraints. But it's very critical. Once they start targeting journalists, it's mainly about burying evidence, because each journalist is a gatekeeper to a huge amount of information. It's also about an informational blackout wide all around the Gaza Strip so that no more information comes out. That's why we see Israel cutting fuel and supplies to northern Gaza now at the moment of this military campaign, so that you stop hearing what is going on in there.
Making life extremely difficult for everybody, including journalists. Jodie, when you hear about this, when you hear that journalists are casting aside their press jackets, which are supposed to protect them, but now make them a target, what do you feel? Because you work for the Committee to Protect Journalists. What protections exist in Gaza for journalists today?
None whatsoever, and I feel totally and utterly heartbroken. It is... I have never experienced anything like this. I've worked for more than 2 decades as a journalist, and I have never experienced anything like this. The sight of journalists mourning their colleagues on an almost daily basis, the sight of Fadi and Ali in hospital, still denied medical treatment, which again feels like another way of punishing Al Jazeera, preventing further information getting out of Gaza. there is no protection. There is no protection. As we've heard, there are international rules around war. Journalists are civilians and should never be targeted. No civilian should be targeted. No civilian should be hit indiscriminately in the way that we are seeing in Gaza. And one of the challenges that we have is not only that journalists are being swept up in these indiscriminate killings, but that, as we have seen in this latest attempt to smear the Al Jazeera journalists are being set up as legitimate targets. So being accused of being terrorists or being accused of being used as human shields to excuse and justify their unlawful killings, war crimes, essentially. But the really terrifying thing is, that works because, as we've heard, then people decide that they're not going to report. And we absolutely need that information. We need those individuals who are going to give evidence, provide the information, show the photographs, show the videos for what is happening inside Gaza. And with every journalist killed, with every journalist who decides not to report, with every journalist injured, with every journalist displaced, we have less and less information coming out of Gaza. And all of that, of course, is part and parcel of a much bigger censorship regime that we've seen from Israel, in which they've hit media buildings, media facilities, civilian infrastructure. They've closed Al Jazeera. They've closed Al Jazeera in Israel and in Ramallah. They've prevented international journalists getting in to Gaza, which again is unprecedented in war over the past 2 decades, 3 decades. Even in the most egregious wars, international journalists have been able to find some way in. We have not seen that in this last 12 months.
No, we've even had the US House Democrats writing a letter to President Joe Biden demanding that he pressure the Israeli government to let in foreign journalists. Gideon, do you think that that Prime Minister Netanyahu is paying any attention to those sort of demands?
No, obviously not, and it's even not on his table. He is now dedicated to continue the war in any price. He ignores requests of the American administration, so he will totally ignore other appeals from all kinds of civil society organizations. He is far away from all this. Human rights never interested him, by the way, in the past. International law for him, like for most of the Israelis, is an anti-Semitic tool against Israel, nothing but this. And therefore Israel can totally ignore it and will totally ignore it until the world will wake up and put an end to it.
I mean, I just wanted to pick up, Gideon, on something that Jodie said just a little earlier. She said that Israel is trying to justify its actions in providing this so-called evidence, alleging that these 6 journalists are linked to Palestinian armed groups. I just wanted to know, who is Israel trying to justify its actions to? Because it's shown scant regard for international opinion, even international humanitarian law.
Look, if there is an opportunity, if they found those forms where those names appeared, why not to throw it to the air? Not that in Israel anyone cares about it, by all means not. I mean, they can continue to kill, and very few in Israel would care about it, including my colleagues, the journalists, who never say the word about this mass killing of journalists in Gaza. So I don't think they put special efforts to justify themselves. But if there is an opportunity, if there are those forms which show that someone recruited to the Hamas in the age of 10 or 15, why not to show it? And some Israelis will believe it, and some European and American maybe will believe it. And by this, they will justify the killing of all 150 journalists that they killed, because they are all terrorists, as we know. For most of the Israelis, all the people of Gaza are terrorists. We have to understand it. And therefore, they can all be targeted. They all committed the crimes of the 7th of October. And therefore, they all deserve death.
Mohammed, given the extraordinarily difficult conditions that all Gazans are living in, and especially journalists are living in, as they try to continue their work, as they try to get the message out, what do you think it is that drives these people, all the people who we see, Al Jazeera Arabic, Al Jazeera English, fixers, freelancers, people who are blogging, people who are on social media, anyone who's trying to get the message out, as Gideon says, becomes more of a target for the Israelis. What drives people to keep doing it?
No, it's basically the will to live, this sort of undying will to survive. It's basically people are there going to great lengths every day. Like I have friends who have to walk kilometers and kilometers to just charge a phone with a solar panel out in the open under airstrikes, just hoping that maybe a video they publish or something they manage to film might move the conscience, the sleeping conscience of the world. There is this sort of persistence to try to do whatever you can do to make the war stop at any point at all. And basically, I hear it from a lot of people at this particular moment. It's very frightening and depressing, where people are saying, no, it doesn't matter anymore what I post or write. We're not going to change. We're not going to sway. We're not going to win any sympathy. Why keep doing it? That's a very frightening moment of despair. But nonetheless, you have this very energy that is tied to survival, where people understand that if the cameras stop, if the noise stops on social media, in Al Jazeera, in other news channels, Israel will get away with much, much, much worse than what it is inflicting on Gaza at the moment. So it is some sort of desperate defense mechanism to survive, to just want to live, to try to move the sleeping conscience of the world. And unfortunately, it's not working. That's the depressing part.
Jodie, he's right, isn't it? I mean, no matter what pictures come out of Gaza, of the devastation, of the horror, of the deaths, of the starvation, of the siege, of the hospital floors covered in blood and covered in people who've been injured in bombings, no matter what pictures are being shown, and this is not Hamas propaganda, as Israel would like to have us believe. These are pictures, this is video, that the pictures don't lie. What impact has it had, do you think? Because it doesn't seem to have shifted the dial on international opinion.
It certainly hasn't shifted the dial on governmental political action, although we are beginning to see some movement from some countries, not the US, unfortunately, but from some countries. I just want to go back to something that you asked Gideon about and why Israel might do this. I think this is a really important question, why it might bother to kind of release this information. It's part and parcel of an attempt to discredit that information coming out. If you say, well, these people are just terrorists, you can obfuscate, you can there create a kind of sense amongst people that the images that they see should not be trusted. That's deliberate. That's absolutely deliberate to make the international population doubt what it is seeing. It's a form of kind of gaslighting, right? That if the people taking the pictures, the people producing these reports are terrorists, then what they're producing cannot be credible. And so it's intentional to make us doubt the images that we see. And I think what we need to stress over and over again is that those images coming out of Gaza from Gazan journalists that Gazan journalists have been producing for over a year, despite the most atrocious conditions, are images that we must take extremely seriously. They are trustworthy images. They are trustworthy videos. These are not made up by propagandists. This is what is happening in Gaza, and the international community needs to wake up and they need to take action.
Jodie, this Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the defence minister, they're already wanted by the ICC. There's already a request out for an arrest warrant for them for war crimes. Do you see this adding to that list of war crimes, alleged war crimes?
Well, yes, and one of the things about why journalists do what they do is a bearing witness. You hope that by documenting these horrors that something will change and that something will move quickly. The important and the key thing is to bear witness, to have that evidence. And we know that in other wars, the images and the information and the stories documented by journalists have been used to bring justice and to get accountability. So, we hope and we pray that these images will move something in this war, but we also know that the evidence that is being gathered will be used for many years to come as those who've been wrongfully killed seek justice.
OK. Gideon, Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, has just been in the region. To what extent do you feel the US has turned a blind eye to this targeting of journalists? I want to just recall a report from the very early days of the war in October a year ago, when Antony Blinken reportedly asked the Qatari Prime Minister to, quote, turn down the volume of Al Jazeera's Gaza coverage. Today we had him saying journalists must be protected and far too many lives have been lost. But to what extent has the US enabled it?
Analyze the way that Blinken is describing the situation. You just quoted him. Too many lives of journalists were taken. No, Mr. Blinken, too many journalists were killed by the Israeli army. That's the way to say it. Their life was not taken by God or by fate. Their life was taken by the Israeli army that you support, you finance, you arm, and you stand behind it. So this hypocrisy, really, those hollow declarations of Blinken again and again, let's improve the humanitarian aid to Gaza, let's not kill so many journalists, let's kill a little bit less journalists, and then we'll have our peaceful mind as we wish. This shows the weakness and the hypocrisy of the American administration. Nothing but this.
Mohammed, just the last word to you. As long as this war continues, do you believe that journalists will continue to be at risk?
Yes, absolutely. As you mentioned earlier, Israel is launching a very sort of determined campaign premised on two things: banning all international journalists from access to Gaza, absolutely banning all of them, unless they are willing to be embedded with the IDF and film only what the IDF want them to film and what they want them to see as part of Israeli propaganda. And then the second premise is basically delegitimizing, threatening, intimidating, terrorizing, and outright killing, arresting, kidnapping, wounding journalists on a mass scale. Right now in Gaza, the amount of journalists that Israel has killed is about almost 3 times as many as all journalists that were killed in all 20 years of the American war in Vietnam and in the entirety of the Second World War. It's unprecedented in every sense of the word. And as long as there is no sort of pressure on Israel, as long as there is no red line being drawn in the sand very genuinely, not just rhetorically because of American elections, as long as that is not in place, Israel will continue to target journalists nonstop.
OK. I want to thank all of you very much for coming in today on the programme to talk about this very important topic, of course, one that's very close to our hearts here at Al Jazeera. Mohammed Shehada, Jodie Ginsberg and Gideon Levy. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.